The purpose of this video is to demystify drama styles for literature students. Before we begin, a bit of a disclaimer. Students of drama might find this particular overview a little bit thin. The audience for this are literature students, so we're not going to each of these styles in tremendous depth. If you're looking for a depth study of each of these, I would suggest going to a number of other resources, but the purpose of this is for those literature students. And the learning intentions here are to be able to identify the key drama styles that you might encounter and to understand the significance of these, and to be able to make use of this understanding to amplify your ability to make meaning of these texts. On the right hand side of the screen you can see the range of drama styles we'll be looking at in this video. This isn't an overview of every single drama style out there. These are just the dominant ones that you might see in a literature course. Now let's begin with classical theatre. For this, think Shakespeare, even Greek theatre. There's limited props to convey setting and atmosphere. There's a lofty grand prose and or verse dialogue, and it relies upon imagination of the audience. The three unities of time, place and action are observed in this kind of theatre. And it doesn't aim to realistically represent the world. So the key features of this are soliloquies and asides, verse language and non-realistic sets. And so, moving forward a few hundred years, and we have the Wellmade Play, and this emerged in 19th century France. It draws on the neoclassical desire for strong form and structure, and it lends itself to comedies and farces. But many realistic dramas drew heavily on the conventions of this genre, thinking J.B. Priestley's and Inspector Calls. Oscar Wilde's comedies of manners are great examples of well-made plays. So in this we do have kind of realistic sets, the parlour rooms of Victorian England, for instance. And the features of this are very tight plots and a very tight climax. Most of the action takes place before the beginning of the play. And plot contrivances such as letters falling into the wrong hands and coincidences and those sorts of things are features of this. And the plays are open-ended. There's life for the characters after the final curtain. And this is an interesting, innovation. Is that if we go back to classical theatre, such as a tragedy like Hamlet, there is no life after the end of Hamlet for the main players. They're all dead. And so the well-made play has this notion that beyond the action of the play, those characters go on living. Moving on to epic theatre, this comes from Bertolt Brecht in the interwar period. He manipulates the dramatic conventions to code political comments aimed at the German government. He forces audiences to constantly return to rational observation rather than emotional immersion. And that's where this idea of alienation, which you might hear about in relation to epic theatre, is a little bit confusing for some because of, the translation from the original German. But alienation isn't to make the audience unwelcome in the theatre. It's there to make the audience step back and make these rational observations and to think. And there are sudden bursts of song, elements of absurdity and breaches of the fourth wall, and these are all prime examples of how this rational observation is constantly revitalized. Epic theatre was used to make powerful political comments. Thus, the distancing of the audience was to force them to maintain rationality rather than getting lost in the play. So the features here are the breaking of the fourth wall, the sudden bursts of song, the alienation of the audience, simplified non-realistic sets, and the actors do not become characters in this, and actors play multiple characters. Now, realist theatre emerged slightly before, but also during this same period. So realist dramas aim to bring greater fidelity to real life. Now, romantic theatre had already established use of elaborate sets and scenery, but realists drew on this to create scenes that reflected a world closer to real life. They were a response to the poverty created by industrialization. Characters' internal motivations become central, and they're influenced by science through Darwin and Freud. So the key figures in this, Ibsen in the 19th century, Shaw and Miller into the 20th century. So the features of realist theatre are the use of detailed sets and props, characters who move and talk in a manner similar to everyday life, plot conventions drawn from the well-made play, such as action before the beginning of the play, plot twists, and it discarded soliloquies and asides. But one of the things that defines realist theatre input is that the characters in their dialogue do wait for each other to finish talking. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next kind of theatre, that's naturalist theatre. But realist theatre is something that you'll likely encounter often, particularly in unseen close readings in exams. Naturalist theatre is a little bit tricky because it's hard to tell where realism ends and naturalism begins, because in many ways naturalism is an extension of realism. The characters in these plays are a product of their environment, and this kind of theatre looked to affirm the Darwinian view of heredity and that we're all products of our environment. And that's also true of realism. But theatre in naturalism should be a slice of life, and that word slice of life is what separates naturalist theatre from realist theatre. Realism and naturalism diverge chiefly on the degree of choice that the characters have, while naturalism believes in the overall strength of external forces over internal decisions. Realism asserts the power of the individual to choose. And I guess one way to think about that is in naturalist plays, the characters are at odds with the world around them and maybe even just pushed along by the winds of change that surround them. But as I mentioned earlier, the dialogue is a key discriminator here, in that in naturalist theatre, the dialogue tends to show characters tripping over each other, talking over the top of each other, even having different conversations at each other, rather than the realist observance of, I guess, the one person speaks, another one listens, and they take their turns talking. Like realism, naturalist theatre has detailed sets and props to create a sense of reality. I guess one way to think about it is that naturalism is even a heightened realism. So surrealist theatre emerged in the aftermath of World War I. It draws on the work of Freud, especially with representations of the unconscious. It explores human dreams and unconscious desires, and it tries to express the workings of the unconscious. And in doing this, it creates an unstable reality. Now, this challenged audiences and was absorbed into the theatre of the absurd. Now, the features of this kind of theatre: surprise, unexpected juxtapositions, non-realistic sets. Now, in my experience of literature, you don't often come across surrealist theatre, particularly in exams, but it is good to know about it as part of this movement from realism into this theatre of the absurd. And the reason for that is that you can see how genre and style itself is drawn from the context that the text was created from, the context of the writer. So, as I just mentioned, surrealism was absorbed into theatre of the absurd. And the theatre of the absurd comes from a philosophical movement, and that is existentialism, this idea that we live in a universe that really doesn't care about us. We live in a universe where there is no implicit meaning. And the cataclysms of World War I and II made the theatre that came before it seem unsatisfying. It presents a view that all human attempts to significance are futile, they're illogical, and that ultimate truth is chaos. And this is at the centre of existentialism. Underlying all this, we have plays that are essentially about nothing, and the key figures in this movement are Beckett, Edward Albee, and Pinter. So the features of theatre of the absurd: a rejection of realistic settings and situations, and portrayal of meaninglessness, isolation, and the breakdown of language. Now, all of this theatre, I guess, can be broken into two parts, and this is particularly useful in the close reading section of an exam. These two kinds of theatre, representational and presentational theatre, are kind of as their title suggests. Representational theatre aims to represent the real world on stage, and it has the audience as passive watchers of the action. The audience passively sits off the stage in their chairs watching the action on the stage, and the artists strive to get the audience to suspend their disbelief, to accept what they're seeing on stage as real. Presentational theatre, on the other hand, just doesn't bother with any of that. The audience is challenged by creating a moment-to-moment reality. Actors change character in front of the audience, there are minimal sets, and the fourth wall is blurred. So a good example of this, if you want to see presentational theatre in action is the Laramie Project. If you look it up on YouTube, you can see a range of performances to see it in action. And so in the Laramie Project and other presentational theatre, you have an actor on stage talking to the audience, reporting to the audience, perhaps in the position of a reporter, but then becoming a character and basically reporting to the audience rather than constructing a version of reality. Presentational theatre can be is one kind of theatre that you could see in a close reading section of an exam. So being aware of the difference between these two is important. Now, the key learnings from here are that styles of theatre emerge when the current isn't enough to satisfy what a creator wants to say about the world, and that they're directly influenced by the ideas that are circulating around them. Styles of theatre influenced by what's happening also in other art forms, such as painting or in philosophy. I'm not saying philosophy is an art form, but you get my meaning. When you write about a dramatic style, keep in mind that what that style is trying to achieve. For example, if it looks naturalistic, you are looking at a text that is trying to represent reality, and that gives you that hook to be able to interpret it. Now, the pure examples of dramatic style aren't easy to find because most plays borrow elements of other styles in specific scenes, and many plays want to be described, many plays might be described as a style for the most part. For example, Jack Davis's No Sugar is, for the most part, naturalistic, but blends the conventions of naturalism with a number of dramatic techniques from other styles. This is good news. It means that under pressure, it's fine to say this scene uses elements of naturalistic theatre, which can be seen in its use of dialogue, blah, blah, blah. So, in all of this, I hope what I've been able to achieve here is to give you a good overview of these kinds of dramatic styles, do some wider reading, see how they fit together. And I hope this has been useful to you. Good luck.